Hello and welcome to Tank and AFE News. My name's Tom, and this is an installment of Tank Talk where I just sort of go on about any particular topic that happens to strike my fancy on any particular day. And today I was thinking about the US M2 and M2A1 medium tanks of the late 1930s. Now, these, of course, were the standard US medium tanks at the outbreak of World War II, and they were not built in large numbers. Over 100, but not a whole lot more than that, before being replaced rather quickly by the M3, the Lee and the Grant, and which were in turn, of course, replaced by the M4 Sherman, which would become the primary U.S. tank during World War II. Now, what's interesting about the M2 and the M2A1, which is a slightly improved version, was that these vehicles never saw combat. There were, like I said, not that many were produced, and the ones that were used only for training purposes. And it's generally regarded as not a particularly good tank. So I went through just some of the common internet sources and a couple books to sort of see what's written on the M2 and how it's generally presented. So, for example, if you go to Tank Encyclopedia website, it just says that as an obsolete configuration, the M2 compared poorly to other European tanks. Furthermore, if you go to Wikipedia, it says the M2 is already obsolete when it entered service. It compared poorly with contemporary European tanks, such as the French S-35 and the German Panzer III. As far as books, so I looked in my old Tank Data Aberdeen Proving Ground series book from the 60s, and it just says a little note at the bottom of the description that just says, typical American design thinking in the 1938 period, a good power plant, but little else. And then last quote I'll give here is from noted tank expert and writer Steven Zaloga, and in his new Osprey book on U.S. Early armor, he says the M2 and M2A1 were the most embarrassing and ill-conceived American tanks in the 1930s. So there you have it. And Steven Zaloga is a guy that, as they say, has probably forgotten more about tanks than I'll ever know, and that is quite true. So, seeing that and having to argue against that notion is, it's probably a bad idea on my part, but here I go. My contention is that the M2, while certainly a design with problems, is not a perfect vehicle by any stretch, is not that much worse than anything else in service in 1940. So and the reason I use 1940 as the benchmark is that all the sources will say that after the fall of France in 1940, right after that, the U.S. Army starts to sort of really look at its own composition and equipment and reevaluate a lot of things. And that's when they realize that they really want something with a 75 millimeter gun. They hear reports about the Panzer IV having a 75 millimeter gun, and they decide that the M2 is not going to cut it. And that, of course, leads to the development of the M3, which has a 75 millimeter gun in that side hull sponson. So, what are the problems with the M2? Why are people so critical of it? The main thing is it's, number one, armor and firepower. It's not much better than the M3 light tank, or even the M2 light tank for that matter. It's got the 37 millimeter gun, which I would argue is a perfectly adequate gun in 1939 and 1940. And the armor protection is not spectacular. We're talking like an inch or a little more than an inch, so which is pretty standard for the era. But then it's also a very tall design because it's got a ridiculous number of machine guns. It's kind of got this superstructure with a machine gun on each corner, sort of like they're called barbettes in a lot of the books, but it's a really rather silly design, and it means that you've got an excessively large crew for a vehicle that size. Some places say 6, some say 7 crew member, but then a relatively small turret, because the turret's almost identical to what's on the light tank. So whatever ergonomic issues there are with the old Stuart turret, that's also going to apply to the M2 medium. That said, though, you have a pretty powerful engine, because this is the first use of the R975 Whirlwind, which would go on the M4 and M4A1, and essentially the same suspension and automotive guts to it that would later be used in the M3. So mobility-wise, it's a pretty capable vehicle. And it's sort of interesting to think, okay, so if the United States, so we're going to do a little alt history here, had, let's say, sent an expeditionary force to France, prior to the German invasion of 1940 to fight alongside the British Expeditionary Force and the French. How would the M2 medium compare to the tanks of their allies, and how would they compare it to the tanks that they'd be facing in 1940? Like, how obsolete is this tank actually in 1940? And if you look at it, sort of on paper, it actually looks pretty good at first. Against the German tanks, I mean, obviously it's superior in firepower to a Panzer I or II. That goes without saying. Uh, the Panzer 35s and 38s and the Panzer III all have 37 millimeter guns. So in terms of firepower, it's roughly the same as those. And none of the German tanks have more than 30 millimeter of armor, so the armor is not any better than what's on the M2 either. So frankly, all those vehicles have the firepower to destroy each other at normal combat ranges, pretty much. Of course, you also have the Panzer IV, 75 millimeter howitzer, sort of a different equation there. But again, the Panzer IV is not any better armored. So, and the mobility of the M2 is pretty decent. So, in all those regards, it's probably got a disadvantage against the Panzer III and IV in terms of crew ergonomics. It does not have a 3-man turret. But overall, those technical differences, probably it's going to come down more to, the training and skill of the crews and the tactical situation than it is any inherent technical issues with the vehicles themselves. So I think in 1940, the M2 is going to be able to stand up against what the Germans are fielding at that particular point. It's not necessarily better than some of the better German tanks, but it could hold its own. Now, compared to what the other allies are using, I mean, French tanks in that period are just a very weird and confusing mess, and I've spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around them. But the majority of them are these little 2-man infantry tanks, many of which are equipped with low-velocity 37 millimeter guns of World War I vintage. And I think the M2 is clearly a more useful tank than those. You could say that the M2 does not compare as well to the S-35, the Somois, or the Char B1 bis in terms of firepower and armor. Both of those tanks, though, I mean, the 47 millimeter gun is not that much better than the 37, frankly, in terms of penetration. Of course, the Char B1 bis has the hull-mounted 75, but both of the French tanks have some real serious ergonomic issues as well. And it's really hard to and reliability issues. So, are they that much better than the M2? It's sort of hard to say. And as far as the British stuff, I mean, obviously, the British infantry tanks, the Matilda 1 is a wretched little thing. The Matilda 2, firepower-wise, it's the 2-pounder, which is pretty similar to 37. It's got incredible armor for the period. Other than that, then the British cruiser tanks are thinly armored, not particularly reliable, and again, 2-pounder gun, not much better than the 37. And some of the cruiser tanks are just really weird. I mean, the A9 with the twin machine gun turrets on the front is almost a bigger sin in my mind than the machine gun barbettes on the M2. So everybody's tanks in 1940, there's just a lot of stuff out there that is pretty obvious. This is stuff that's developed in the 1930s. A lot of countries are still sort of figuring out best practices in tank design and tank construction, and there's not really consensus on it. So, with that said, here is my argument for the M2. Aside from the fact that it's really not that much worse than anything else in 1940, it provides the basis for everything that comes after it. This is kind of an amazing machine in that in 1940 the U.S. has a tank that, while the tank itself is not fantastic, it can be turned into something much better without doing a huge amount of reworking. I mean, if you look at the tracks and suspension and the overall characteristics of the M2, it's not like they had to massive, resize the hull significantly or do major modifications to those systems to make the M3 and then later the M4. It also sort of evolved and gave the U.S. a really good basis for developing their family of medium armored vehicles throughout the war. And not a lot of countries had vehicles like that in 1940. Not have a vehicle that provided a good basis for moving forward at that point. And in fact, the first few years of the war, they're kind of floundering to find such a thing. It takes them a while before they come up with a suitable engine. Finally they do with the Meteor. Um, but as far as infantry tanks, they have to come up with the Churchill, which is a completely new. It's not based on the prior infantry tanks at all, and the cruiser tank development took all sorts of weird meandering roads that are well beyond the scope of this video. But the British tank development is not a happy story. French tanks of the period of 1940, there's certainly nothing you can look at and say that's the basis for future development. You're not going to develop the Char B1 bis into something more modern and better. It's already incredibly dated design and concept in 1940. The Somme is just too small. It doesn't have the horsepower, doesn't have the size to really be developed in anything a whole lot better. The only other tanks in service in 1940 that provide the basis for future development the way the M2 does is on the German side. That's the Panzers 3 and 4. The 3, of course, will serve to the end of the war, mostly in the form of, the Sturmgeschütz assault guns, and the Panzer 4 both as assault guns and as a battle tank. So, in that regard, I would say the M2 was a very successful design. So that's my rant on the M2. Hopefully, if you enjoyed it or found it useful, make a comment, subscribe, all that stuff. Anyhow, stay safe, and we will catch you on the next one.